I've been living out here in the Appalachian Mountains for most of my life, and I always thought I knew what to expect once the sun went down. Coyotes yipping in the distance, maybe a black bear rustling around. Nothing much shakes me. But on this night, everything changed. Let me start by saying my evening had been uneventful, just chores and a quick dinner before midnight rolled around. Jax, my retriever, was curled up by the fireplace like he always is. He's the most relaxed dog on the planet, rarely even barks unless the mailman shows up. That's why I nearly dropped my coffee when I heard this growl coming from him, deep and raw, unlike anything I'd heard before. I glanced at him and saw he was standing rigid, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the window. I couldn't see anything but my own reflection in the glass, and I tried to shrug it off, mumbling something like, "Easy, buddy." But inside I was rattled. I've never seen Jax look that tense, tail stiff, nose practically glued to the window. It was enough to get my heart pounding. Soon, I realized I still had to lock up my workshop down the slope behind the house. Normally this isn't a big deal, just a quick trip in the dark with a flashlight, but the way Jax was acting, let's just say I was on edge. Still, I convinced myself it was no big deal. I grabbed my coat, clicked on the flashlight, and headed out. Jax insisted on coming, practically pressing against my leg with every step. Outside, the air felt strange. I couldn't place why. Maybe it was too still. No crickets, no wind through the branches, just a heavy quiet. Halfway to the workshop, Jax let out another warning growl that made my stomach tighten. Before I could turn on my heel, I noticed the workshop door was slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to keep going. I tugged the door shut and locked it, and that's when this insane commotion erupted in the woods behind me. I can't fully do the sound justice, but it was like a sudden surge of noise tearing through the undergrowth. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, almost like a crowd sprinting among the trees. I froze, and Jax just pressed against me, teeth bared. Whatever caused that ruckus had to be larger than a raccoon or fox. It sounded massive. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the flashlight, nearly dropping it. I backed up toward the house, trying not to break into a sprint, though my legs were begging me to run. The closer we got to the porch, the more frantic everything felt. I got inside, practically shoved the door shut, and slid the deadbolt into place. My brain was racing, trying to explain what I'd just heard. A bunch of deer. A bear with cubs. But it was so loud, so widespread, like multiple creatures. I stood in the hallway, breath hitching, Jax at my feet, staring at the door. I realized I'd left my pistol upstairs. Adrenaline was making my hands tremble. My pulse hammered as I rushed to my bedroom, grabbed the gun, and made sure it was loaded. I've never felt so desperate to be armed in my own home. Just as I debated whether to investigate or hide, Jax let out a bark. That bark. He only does that when something's seriously wrong. So, against every instinct, I headed back out onto the porch with my flashlight and pistol. My chest was tight, my breathing uneven, but I needed to know if there was an intruder or some animal messing around. I scanned the tree line with the beam. Nothing moved. Silence reigned, almost unnaturally, as though nature itself took a step back, waiting to see what I'd do next. Then, just as I was about to turn and go inside, I heard this low murmur, more like a swarm of hushed voices than a single sound. It came from the very edge of my property, out near where the trees thickened. My stomach dropped. It didn't sound like English, but it was disturbingly close to speech. Jax whimpered, tail tucked, as if he wanted to drag me inside. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like eyes were on me, a presence both everywhere and nowhere. The murmurs seemed to shift direction, echoing out from multiple spots at once. My light swept across the yard, revealing not one silhouette, not one flicker of movement. Yet the voices, if that's what they were, didn't stop. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might collapse right there on the porch. I forced myself to breathe through it, whispering Jax's name for a shred of comfort. After what felt like ages, I managed to pull myself back inside. That door had never felt so flimsy. I latched it and checked the windows, too spooked to turn on any indoor lights, hoping that darkness would hide me. The night wasn't over, though. I had a terrible feeling this was only the beginning. Like whatever was out there wasn't done with me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with some random animal. This felt orchestrated, purposeful, and it was tightening around me, step by step. I didn't have a clue what was causing it, but I knew one thing for sure. My home, my safe space, was no longer secure. Jax's instincts had been right from the start, and I dreaded what might be next. I had barely closed my eyes for a second, couldn't rest even if I tried, with every nerve in my body on high alert. Jax was tense, pacing the living room and refusing to leave the front door. I kept the lights off, thinking somehow it would make me less of a target. My phone sat on the table, but out here in the middle of nowhere, good luck trying to call for help. Even if I did get a signal, what could I possibly say to emergency services? Hello, yes, there are voices surrounding my house, and I don't see anyone but my dog is freaking out. That weird muttering from outside seemed to vibrate through the walls, like a low chorus of whispers just behind the wooden panels. It was maddening because I couldn't single out a phrase or identify if it was even human speech. It rose and fell in waves, and every so often it almost sounded like chanting, I guess. I was too rattled to be sure. All I knew was that my gut told me there were multiple presences out there. More than one set of footsteps had circled the house after I first came inside. After another minute of pacing, I finally thought, screw it, I need to see what's happening. I edged over to the window beside my front door, careful not to rustle the curtains. The instant I leaned forward, the noise outside cut off, like someone hit a switch. In its place was the deepest, most all-consuming silence. Not a single insect chirping, no rustle of leaves, just my own ragged breathing. I can't express how unsettling it is to realize that whatever's out there knows when you move. The second I froze, I heard a slight shuffle near the corner of the house. Then that quiet murmuring started back up again, more agitated than before. I grabbed my pistol from the coffee table and quietly approached another window that looked out toward the gravel driveway. Jax followed, ears down and tail stiff, as if he expected an attack. When I shifted the curtain a millimeter, the mumbles faded out again. Something was definitely keyed into every movement I made, and that realization caused my stomach to churn. Time dragged on. I checked my phone. 1:47 a.m. It had only been an hour since I'd first heard that thunderous crashing in the woods, but it felt like half the night had passed. I decided to kill the darkness with a chance at visibility, so I clicked on the porch light. Nothing in the yard, no bodies, no shapes, not even a stray raccoon. My flashlight remained on the table, but I felt no urge to go out there again. A part of me sensed if I opened that door, I'd be swallowed whole. Jax's eyes stayed locked on the windows. Now and then, a single footstep crunched the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. One step, pause. Another step, pause. It was unbearable not to open a window and yell, but I couldn't bring myself to be that reckless. My mind kept thinking back on old stories from my grandparents, about things in the hills that weren't exactly animal and not quite human either. Tales I'd once dismissed as pure folklore. But here I was, feeling cornered by something I couldn't see. To keep myself sane, I jotted notes on a pad. What times I heard the footsteps, what they sounded like, how the whispering seemed to move around the property in a clockwise pattern. Once or twice, I considered switching on music or the TV just to drown it out, but a voice in my head told me to stay alert, not to mask the sounds. After all, if something crashed through the door, I needed to know instantly. Hours crawled by this way. My nerves were shot, my hands clammy, and every muscle ached with tension. I found myself drifting off only to jolt awake seconds later whenever Jax twitched. It was like living on a fault line, expecting the earth to quake at any moment. Meanwhile, the murmurs persisted outside, underscored by that dead silent hush whenever I tried to move. It was a twisted game. They made sure I knew they were there, but not once did I see a face or a form. Sometime around 4:30, or maybe closer to 5 a.m., the tone of the murmuring changed. Hard to explain, but the pitch went lower, almost guttural. Then, slowly, the sound started drifting away, deeper into the woods. I caught faint rustling through the thick brush, then a final few snaps of branches. In their wake, frogs croaked and a couple of birds called. It was as if the natural world had been stifled all night and finally breathed again. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't that comforting. I still felt like I might vomit from the stress. I checked each window for any sign of movement. Nothing. The gravel driveway looked untouched, aside from my own footprints. Jax gradually relaxed, though he wouldn't lie down until the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon. Once I was fairly certain the immediate threat had disappeared, I stepped outside onto the porch for a breath of air, pistol clutched tight in my hand. The yard was a mess of broken branches, and the lingering smell of disturbed soil clung to the morning breeze. Yet, bizarrely, there were no footprints, no trace of a crowd or gang of animals. The only proof was in my shaking limbs and Jax's raw-edged stare. I spent sunrise going back and forth, mentally replaying each horrifying moment. My place still felt uneasy, like the echoes of those voices might start up again any second. I didn't dare pack up and leave. Part of me needed to know if this was a one-time nightmare or an ongoing threat. I downed 2 cups of coffee, watched the brightening sky, and told myself I'd figure out what to do next. For now, daylight was my only shield, and I was not about to let my guard down. Jax and I sat there in a haunted silence, expecting something to re-emerge, hoping that it wouldn't. Sunrise brought the faintest sense of relief, yet my nerves still buzzed with every stray sound. I locked the doors, sealed every window, and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing about it fit neatly into the realm of normal. Part of me wanted to believe that it was some freak incident, maybe a collective hallucination brought on by stress. Still, the unease in my chest whispered that whatever took up residence in the darkness that night is out there, lurking beyond the edges of reason, waiting for another moment to slip back into my world. For now, I've recounted every detail here, hoping to warn others. Sometimes, the eerie stories we dismiss might be truer than we're willing to admit. I've been drawn to the Appalachian region for as long as I can remember. Something about those towering slopes and shadowy hollows always felt like a gateway into a different world. Beautiful, yet laced with an unsettling aura that's tough to articulate. A few friends and I decided to head out to Holly River State Park in West Virginia, lured by rumors of an old family cemetery hidden up on a ridge. We had only a vague idea of where it might be. All we knew was that we needed to follow a winding trail that cut through dense undergrowth before climbing up toward this rumored graveyard. So the 3 of us piled into my car early that morning, excited by the prospect of a day hike. The drive itself was so quiet that we began making offhand jokes, like something was waiting out there, just beyond view. Maybe it was nerves talking, or maybe I'd had too much coffee. Either way, my stomach churned in that weird way it does when you're both excited and half spooked. When we arrived, the parking lot near the main trailhead had a few vehicles, but we didn't cross paths with any actual people. The entire place seemed deserted. We shrugged, figuring everyone must have already started their morning treks. After all, Holly River is a decently sized park. Folks could be scattered across countless trails. I tried to keep my mind on the gorgeous landscape, moss-covered stones, towering hardwoods, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Yet there was this hush underneath it all, like nature had dialed itself down a notch. We kicked off our hike around midday. The sky was overcast, so the light filtering through the branches came in muted silvery patches. The trail was pretty well worn at first, so we made quick progress. The chatter between us died off once we noticed how oddly calm the forest felt. Everything about the place demanded our attention, from the tangled roots underfoot to the looming canopy overhead. Occasionally we'd catch snatches of movement in our peripheral vision, maybe squirrels, but the scuttling always stopped the moment we tried to look closer. My friend commented that it seemed like the place was sizing us up, and nobody argued. We pressed on, climbing steadily. Eventually, we left the official trail in search of that old graveyard. The path we followed was more of a half-remembered rumor than a marked route. A fallen tree forced us to detour through thick brush, and my arms got scratched up enough that I started wishing we'd picked an easier day hike. Still, I couldn't help feeling compelled to keep going. There was a raw, ancient feel to the land that I couldn't let go of. A couple hours in, the terrain turned steep. Loose stones threatened to send us sliding if we weren't careful, and we had to cling to exposed roots for stability. We nearly missed the cemetery altogether, spotting it only because of a warped iron gate that caught the corner of my friend's eye. A row of leaning tombstones stood beyond, the lettering on them faded and chipped. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they'd been here for centuries. Up close, the graveyard gave off an atmosphere that bordered on oppressive. The headstones bore names we could barely read, and the ground was covered in tangled weeds. The three of us wandered, taking pictures and gingerly brushing aside overgrown vines. Every so often, a subtle breeze would move past us, bringing with it a musty odor that reminded me of damp soil and decaying leaves. My pulse was hammering in my ears for reasons I couldn't explain, but I tried to play it cool. We stayed longer than we intended, mostly because we were fascinated, and maybe a little horrified, by the idea that entire families could be buried out here, forgotten by time. Each time the wind picked up, we paused, half expecting something or someone to step out from behind those looming trees. It was all in my head, I told myself, probably just a side effect of being in a graveyard at sunset. By the time we left, the sun had started sliding down the sky, painting the ridge in murky oranges and purples. We hadn't planned on night hiking, but it was creeping up on us fast. The idea of navigating a dark forest trail made our nerves spike, so we decided the park's main road would be safer, even if it was a bit out of the way. We figured it couldn't be more than a few miles to loop around and reach the campground parking lot. Leaving that cemetery felt like stepping away from a forgotten realm. Once we hit a semblance of a trail again, a fragile sense of relief settled over us. But it was short-lived. The path to the road was riddled with roots, slippery patches, and random branches that snagged at our clothes. Little cracks and snaps echoed in the brush, just enough to keep us on edge. We hurried along, willing ourselves not to think about the dark shapes dancing in our peripherals. Finally, we broke free of the tree line and spotted the asphalt up ahead. The sense of relief was almost overwhelming, like stumbling onto a lifeline in the middle of nowhere. But an uneasy vibe still trailed behind us, no matter how hard we tried to shake it. The light was fading fast, and the road itself looked empty in both directions. No cars, no people, nothing. Just a hush that felt downright eerie. That's where the first leg of our journey ended, with us stepping onto that road and peering into the early twilight. Looking back, I realized we had no clue how unsettling the next stretch would be. In the moment, though, we were just grateful to be out of the thick woods. Little did we know, that relief was about to dissolve quicker than we could have imagined. After stumbling out of the tree line, we reached this narrow asphalt road that was supposed to lead us back to the campground. And for a few fleeting moments, we were relieved. No more tripping over roots or scraping our arms on undergrowth. The wind seemed calmer too, though I swear the air felt heavier than it had in the woods. With dusk rolling in, we figured we had maybe 3 miles to cover, tops. But it was eerily quiet. I mean, you'd expect at least a car or two to pass by in a park this size, even late in the day. Instead, we had this winding stretch of road all to ourselves. I remember my friend joking, "We're basically the only people left on Earth," and none of us cracked a real smile. We picked a direction, based on a ragged sign pointing toward the campground, and started walking, the sun melting into the horizon behind us. As we hiked along, the darkness deepened. The trees on either side of us stood like silent onlookers. Every so often, something would stir in the brush, maybe a small critter or a bird, but we never saw anything. That emptiness felt unnatural, like the park itself was waiting for something to happen. We'd covered about half the distance when we spotted the silhouettes. Up ahead, illuminated by the faint remnants of twilight, were at least 5 figures. They were just standing there in the middle of the road, as if they were waiting for us. Relief surged through me for a second, thankful that we weren't the only ones out there. My friend even waved, though none of them waved back. We moved closer, calling out a timid "hey" or two, hoping for some response. Nothing. They were close enough now that I should have been able to make out features, faces, hair color, clothing details. But it was like I could only see the general shape of them, as if the light was playing tricks. The weirdest part was that they didn't make a sound. No conversation, no footsteps shuffling on asphalt. They were just there, like placeholders. Then, without warning, they started to fade. One by one, they flickered in and out until all that remained was a vacant stretch of road. The three of us were rooted in place, trying to process what was happening. We weren't imagining this. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe our eyes were messing with us after the dim forest. Or maybe they'd just slipped away into the dark. But as we reached the exact spot where we'd seen them, it was clear there was nowhere to go. On one side, a sheer drop fell away into a valley. The other side was a jagged slope of rock that would have been nearly impossible to climb quietly, even in broad daylight. The asphalt itself looked undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of scuffling, not even a stray candy wrapper. Just empty road stretching off into the shadows. A cold sense of dread settled over us. We hung around for a minute, shining phone flashlights and calling out, but nobody answered. The idea of those figures just evaporating forced our tension up several notches. I couldn't tell if we'd witnessed something supernatural, or if my eyes were conspiring against me in the low light. Either way, it triggered a kind of primal fear I haven't felt too often in my life. We finally decided to press on, hearts thumping from the sudden shift in atmosphere. Every step from then on felt like it echoed a little too loudly. We kept glancing back, convinced we'd see the group again, trailing behind us, or maybe popping up ahead. But there was nothing. At one point, I caught a whiff of a faint odor, sort of earthy and decayed, but it was gone as soon as I noticed it. By then, we were moving faster than I'd ever hiked in my life. The final stretch to the campground felt like a fever dream, each of us expecting something horrible to lurch out of the darkness. When we finally caught sight of the campground sign, it was like stepping into another world, only there weren't any people there either. The entire place was disturbingly quiet save for the distant rustle of trees. Usually a state park campground has some buzz, campfires crackling, murmured conversations, maybe a dog barking. We got nothing. Our car was right where we left it, sitting in a patch of moonlit gravel. I can't describe how relieved I was to see it. We clambered inside, locking the doors more out of instinct than necessity. Who locks up in a lonely campground? But something about that night made every protective move feel justified. My friend gunned the ignition, and we peeled out, headlights pushing back the darkness a little. That entire drive out of the park, I kept expecting those figures to emerge from the trees or appear in the rearview mirror. Only once we hit the main highway did we dare speak about it in more than whispers. We tossed around ideas, mass hallucination, illusions caused by the fading light, or maybe some group of locals messing with us. Still, none of those explanations explained the silent disappearance act. Days later, every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those silhouettes flicker and vanish like they'd never existed at all. I've heard plenty of stories about weird sightings in the Appalachians, ghostly hikers, phantom lantern lights bobbing through the trees. But until that night, I brushed them off as campfire tales. Now, I'm not so sure. All I know is that something happened on that silent road, and I can't shake the idea that it was a glimpse into the unknown. That's the story of how a simple day trip to Holly River spiraled into a haunting mystery that continues to gnaw at me. Was it some lost echo of the park's past, or did we stumble into something far stranger than we were prepared to handle? Honestly, I still don't have an answer, but there's one thing I can say for sure. The image of those 5 figures dissolving in the twilight is going to stay with me. I guess not every twist in these old mountains needs a tidy explanation. Sometimes it's enough to know that the darkness holds more secrets than we can ever hope to understand. I'm writing this because every time I look back on my experiences out there, I end up pacing around my apartment, uneasy and restless. People love talking about the Appalachian Trail as if it's just scenic overlooks and friendly hikers, but I learned there's a lot more than meets the eye. Before I ever set foot on that route, I was the type of person who devoured paranormal stories. Something about the unknown always grabbed my attention. Maybe it's just human nature to chase mysteries. By the time I started planning my extended trek, I'd convinced myself that I was more prepared than most for whatever I'd find in those ancient mountains. The reality, completely different. I remember my first stretch near Blood Mountain. History loomed around every bend, not just from the Civil War sites, but from the remnants of tribal conflicts that went on long before European settlers showed up. The ground felt worn in a way that's tough to put into words, like it had absorbed centuries of voices. A couple of nights in, I decided to camp alone in a spot where the trees formed a thick canopy, letting in only patches of moonlight. The moment I unrolled my sleeping gear, I noticed that the usual night chorus, crickets, distant owls, had faded. There was an odd sensation of being watched from multiple angles. My mind started to wander, and I ended up lying awake far longer than I wanted. The strange part is, I was positive I spotted movements where there shouldn't have been any, silhouettes flitting at the periphery of my headlamp's glow. Once or twice, I had the distinct impression of a figure standing behind a distant trunk, dressed in something that didn't fit modern times. I never got a clear look, but that sense of stepping across some invisible threshold kept me wired until sunrise. A few weeks later, I ventured closer to Harper's Ferry, where you can literally walk among the traces of the Civil War trenches. One late afternoon, as the light shifted from gold to a dull gray, I saw a person in old-style military gear drifting along a sunken path. My brain tried to rationalize. Maybe it's a reenactor, maybe I was exhausted, but the person, or whatever it was, vanished almost instantly. The spot fell silent, like everything around had decided to pause. For a second, I questioned if I was alone in that corridor of battered earth. It left me on edge for the next several days, scanning every ridgeline in case something else appeared. But nothing compares to the night a bear and I had our awkward confrontation. I'd rigged up a hammock between two sturdy trunks and dozed off, lulled by the distant rustling. At some unknown hour, a firm prod against my back startled me awake. I reacted without thinking, twisting around and striking with my hand. I connected with fur and realized in horror it was a bear's muzzle. Adrenaline shot through me as I waited for it to decide if I was more trouble than I was worth. Instead, it crashed off through the brush, leaving me stunned and trying to slow my breathing. The rest of that evening, every single noise made me tense up, braced for a second round that, thankfully, never came. Funny thing is, when I mention this to people, they usually fixate on the bear encounter. They don't realize that animals, wild as they might be, don't compare to the unsettling presence that seems embedded in parts of this trail. That feeling of history refusing to let go, those fleeting glimpses of things wearing outdated clothes, the heavy atmosphere around certain places. It's all there, woven into the land. I'd tell myself these experiences were just the product of fatigue. Maybe I'd just been reading too many ghost stories. Yet something nagged at me, like I'd stumbled onto a realm where the past occasionally slips through the cracks. Later, in Pennsylvania, I'd discover what true dread can feel like. That, however, is a story for another post, one that still keeps me alert at odd hours, replaying every step I took through that long, dark night. I thought I'd seen the worst of the trail. Run-ins with spooky silhouettes and a half-asleep confrontation with a bear had me convinced I was prepared for anything. Turns out, Pennsylvania wanted to prove me wrong. After crossing the state line, I remember feeling oddly optimistic. The weather was pleasant enough, and I decided to sleep under the stars rather than set up any shelter. The sky was so clear earlier that evening, and I wanted to experience the open air for once. I laid out my sleeping pad and got comfy in my bag, surrounded by trees and that faint hum of nighttime insects. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime past midnight, I woke up with my heart thumping. The night had gone dead silent, which rattled me. Normally you'd at least hear a hooting owl or wind rustling the branches. Instead, a thin, eerie whine reverberated all around. It was so soft, like it was trying not to exist, but it also seemed inescapable. Every instinct told me I shouldn't remain there. My breathing felt tight, and the air felt heavier than usual, as if some invisible presence had crept in and settled on top of me. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that it might just be the wind through the leaves or some small animal. Yet the whine didn't change pitch, didn't shift direction, didn't do anything I'd label as normal. The dread in the pit of my stomach wasn't something I could shrug off. Within minutes, I was shoving gear back into my pack, fumbling for my headlamp. It took every ounce of willpower not to panic and run blindly through the dark. The moment I found the trail markers and started moving, the heaviness slowly eased. After maybe half a mile, the sensation broke, like stepping out of a dense fog. The noise faded into nothingness, and I stood there, leaning on a tree, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to turn back, search for some logical explanation. The rest of me argued that I should get as far from that spot as possible. In the end, I kept going. Even now, I haven't made sense of what happened, or what was possibly lurking in that empty patch of forest. A few days later, a storm caught me and a group of through hikers near Mount Rogers. Rain hammered the metal roof of a simple shelter, thunder rolling across the sky. We were soaked, shivering, and half-starved. Someone remembered that a local pizza place would deliver to the parking lot if you sweet-talked them enough. The idea of hot food and maybe a six-pack had us pooling whatever money we had left. After a tense wait, lightning flickering in the distance, we spotted headlights. Naturally, we figured our food had arrived. Several of us shuffled out into the downpour, layered in soaked clothes, boots caked in mud, hair plastered to our faces. We must have looked like a nightmare. The driver saw us coming and slammed on the high beams. Tires screeched, reverse lights glowed bright red, and the van spun around so fast we all stood there in confusion. We watched the vehicle vanish back down the road, fishtailing like it was desperate to escape. We exchanged baffled looks, water dripping down our faces, and laughed nervously. Some of the group started joking. Maybe we seemed like forest ghouls or something. 5 minutes later, like clockwork, a different car pulled up, and this time, the driver hopped out, completely unfazed. Apparently he was the real pizza guy, used to hikers in all their rain-soaked glory. He handed over hot pizza boxes, a few cans of cheap beer, and chuckled about us looking like zombies. I can only guess what the first driver's story would be afterward, how a band of unholy creatures approached his van in the middle of nowhere at night. In those moments, I realized that the Appalachian Trail doesn't just feed on spooky legends. Sometimes, genuine comedy and confusion overshadow the fear. Yet, for all the laughs we shared over that botched pizza delivery, I still had the memory of that unsettling whine in Pennsylvania fresh in my head. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd only scratched the surface. The trail has this way of revealing its secrets when you least expect it. One minute you're joking around, dripping wet, begging for food. The next, you're bolting from an unexplainable force in the dead of night. Even now, I look back at Pennsylvania and feel a pang of discomfort. Whatever I sensed out there, whatever generated that unearthly noise, made me think there are places along the trail better left alone, maybe forever. And yet part of me can't resist the pull to keep exploring, half expecting to stumble onto some ancient mystery that refuses to stay buried. Guess that's the real paradox of the Appalachian Trail. It draws you in with beauty, then leaves you with questions that linger night after night. I was closing in on Duncannon, feeling that mix of exhaustion and excitement that comes when you're too far gone to turn around, but not quite close enough to celebrate. About 10 miles out, I spotted a small group of older women huddled around a couple of picnic tables near the trail. They waved me over with warm smiles, so I joined them to rest my legs a bit. They asked if I was a through hiker, and seemed genuinely thrilled about my progress. We traded a few stories. I told them where I started, how many states I'd already trudged through. It felt like your average friendly chatter until they asked where I was sleeping that night. Soon as I mentioned some older shelter a few miles shy of town, their energy shifted. One of them said, "You should really head into Duncannon tonight," while another repeated the advice, adding nothing else, just the same warning. None of them spelled out why, and I remember thinking, are they worried about the weather or something? But their eyes had this urgency, like they knew something I didn't. I tried to press them for details, but they brushed it off, insisting it'd be better if I pushed on to town. My pack was heavy, and my feet were screaming at me, so heading all the way in felt like an extra challenge. Their unease was contagious, though. As I said my goodbyes, that tension they carried clung to me like a damp chill. By late afternoon, I found myself turning off the main stretch of the Appalachian Trail, following a steep side path toward the shelter. The slope was trickier than I expected, with old roots and loose stones that had me stumbling more than once. Overhead, the light was already starting to fade behind thick branches. Normally, I'd be okay with a few hours of dusk hiking, but something about that place just felt heavy. Eventually, I reached two battered structures that I knew from my guidebook were built by Earl Schaffer. He was basically AT royalty, having been the first person to ever hike the entire trail in one go. The shelters looked ancient, sagging in spots, and the musty boards gave off a whiff of age and rot. Nearby was a new shelter under construction, and even from a distance, I noticed carved faces on the beam ends. They peered out in a way I couldn't quite describe, like silent observers in the dying light. I could have stayed in the half-finished shelter, but it seemed even more unsettling with those carved heads, so I stuck to one of the old ones. Inside, the shelter's floor was just round logs placed side by side, barely lifted off the ground. It made for a pretty uneven sleeping surface. I figured I'd seen worse. This was the AT after all. But something about that rickety setup gave me an odd sense of discomfort. I tried to focus on other things. Next day's mileage, where I'd get water, a possible 0 day in Duncannon. But whenever I paused, that prickly awareness returned, like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing around, seeing nothing but old wood, leaves, and a few spiders skittering in the corners. I made dinner quickly, more to keep my hands busy than anything. Every so often, a gust of wind would whistle through the beams, and the shelter groaned like it had a voice of its own. My mind flicked back to the women at the picnic tables. Why were they so insistent I shouldn't be here? The question nagged at me, but without a concrete reason, I brushed it off as local superstition or overprotection. Night fell harder than usual, it seemed. The woods beyond the shelter entrance looked like a solid wall of black. My headlamp beam danced around, catching the edges of rocks and roots outside, but I couldn't shake the weirdness. I tried to sleep, but my senses stayed on high alert. Sometimes a crack of a branch snapped me awake, or a rustle of movement made me think there was someone, or something, lurking beyond the circle of light. When morning finally arrived, the relief I felt was intense. Packing up, I almost sprinted up that trail, my body protesting the sudden climb, but my mind demanding we get moving. With each step, the weight of the place seemed to lessen, replaced by fresh air and the promise of Duncannon's comforts. Still, I couldn't completely shake a lingering unease, like I'd just crawled out from under a dark cloud. It wasn't until I reached town, found a phone, and updated my mail drop contact that I got slapped in the face with the real story. I mentioned that shelter, offhandedly describing it as seriously creepy. That's when she told me about the two hikers. They'd been southbounders, having a friendly chat with a random bar patron in Duncannon. Later that night, this same patron had followed them to that very shelter, waited until they were asleep, and murdered them. Hearing it made my stomach twist, replaying every odd vibe I'd felt, every unsettling sound during the night. Those women at the picnic tables had tried to warn me, but they couldn't bring themselves to say why out loud. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, knowing now what happened in those walls. It was more than just an old shelter. It was a crime scene, a place stained by something monstrous. If I had known, would I still have slept there? Maybe not. But the thought of it being so close to where two people lost their lives shifted the trail in my mind. The wilderness wasn't just bears and storms. It could hold human darkness, too. And I had just walked right into it. I came back to that stretch of the trail a few years later. I hadn't really planned on returning. There was a part of me that wanted to avoid that entire area after learning what had gone down at the old shelters. But life and my hiking routes had a funny way of circling back on themselves. Before I knew it, I was standing at the same cutoff from the main trail, peering down the slope with this knot in my stomach. The trees here looked familiar, yet different, maybe older or scarred by storms. Sunlight trickled through the canopy in thin beams, and a low breeze made the branches sway. I swear it felt like the forest was reminding me, we remember what happened here. Going down that path, I half expected to see the two old shelters just as they'd been. My memory was vivid, those ramshackle logs, the musty smell, the new shelter mid-construction with the carved faces. But when I reached the bottom, I was greeted by an entirely changed scene. The two ancient structures had been torn out, no trace but a few piles of splintered wood near the edge of the clearing. Instead, the new shelter stood proudly in their place, fully completed. The carved faces I'd glimpsed years ago were still there, only now smoothed by weather, or maybe by countless hikers running their hands along them. They seemed less like art and more like watchful eyes. I hesitated, feeling a swirl of relief that the murderous old shelters were gone, mixed with a weird nostalgia for the original version of the place, even if it had been dangerously creepy. As I moved closer, I noticed someone sitting on the newly built porch, sipping from a battered canteen. He wore a bandana and looked like he'd seen a lot of trail miles. When he looked up, I nodded a greeting, and he waved me over. We got to talking, as hikers do. Turns out he'd thru-hiked the trail a few years back, and had come out for a weekend getaway. It wasn't long before we drifted into the subject of the area's grim history. Apparently, there was a formal dedication ceremony once the new shelter was finished, and from what he'd heard, Earl Schaffer himself had been there, only to be brushed off or overshadowed by certain officials. Folks who didn't get the depth of his contribution, or maybe just didn't care. Hearing that made me bristle. Earl had literally shaped part of the trail's legacy, these shelters, the story of the first thru hike, and it hurt to imagine him being sidelined. The conversation took a darker turn when we ventured into the topic of those murders. My companion knew about them too, of course. Everyone who's hiked this area for long enough picks up the rumors, if not the exact details. But he also mentioned how, despite the tragedy, folks in town tried to move on. The new shelter was supposed to symbolize a fresh start, a safe space for hikers passing through. Only, he said, some people believed the land itself still felt tainted, as though the violence of that night hadn't just vanished when the old shelters got ripped out. "Have you felt it?" he asked me, eyes locked onto mine. "That heavy quiet?" I gave a slow nod, remembering the sensation of dread from my own first night here. We both fell into silence, broken only by the rustle of wind and the distant babble of a creek. Eventually, he packed up and left, heading back toward town. I hung around a bit, taking in the new shelter. It looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, just sturdy beams, a proper roof, and enough space to fit a handful of hikers. But those carved faces unnerved me. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn they were almost aware, as if they'd seen more than they let on, listening for footsteps in the night. Later on, I found myself walking north again. The trail was peaceful, the kind of gentle climb that usually empties my mind of worries. Only this time, my thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened there. I wondered if a fresh coat of wood and a brand new name could really erase the memory of two hikers who'd never made it out. A piece of me doubted it. A few weeks down the line, I came across Pierce Pond Shelter in Maine. Beautiful spot, picturesque pond, vibrant autumn colors. But the instant I got there, I felt a pang of that same uneasy tension I'd experienced in Pennsylvania. It wasn't rational. There was no recorded tragedy I knew of, no creeping murderer lurking behind a pine tree. Still, the place had this hush, like it was waiting for something. I tried shaking it off, chalking it up to hiker paranoia or lingering trauma from that other shelter. Yet, As the sun dipped below the pines, the atmosphere felt suffocating. Every rustle outside set my nerves on edge. That's when I started to wonder if it was me, if I was carrying this darkness from shelter to shelter, replaying it in every unfamiliar corner of the trail. The thought alone was enough to keep me wide awake, scanning for silhouettes in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but not peacefully. In the morning, the chill still clung to me. I realized it's not as simple as a single terrible event in one place, or some new construction replacing old bones. The trail might be full of kind souls and breathtaking sights, but it can also trap echoes of the worst moments experienced by those who walked it. The deeper truth is that no matter how many signs we put up or improvements we make, history has a nasty habit of haunting whatever ground it clings to. I left Pierce Pond Shelter feeling a little more shaken, a little more aware of how quickly these woods can go from comforting to unnerving. And as I hiked on, the thought kept circling in my head. The real danger out here isn't always the wildlife or the elements. Sometimes it's the people you cross paths with and the echoes they leave behind, long after they're gone. Be careful out there. I'd planned on taking it easy that evening, maybe practice a few fishing knots, or help Grandpa Morley tidy up the workshop. Instead, a couple of friends, Ray and Kelsey, coaxed me into one last round of our favorite hide-and-seek style game. It was something we'd concocted years ago, chasing each other through every nook and cranny of the Appalachians behind Grandpa's homestead. Funny how you can grow up around these hills and still feel like you've barely scratched the surface of what's out there. The house sits at the base of a ridge that rises into dense hardwood forests. Grandpa always said the land has its own memory, that every gust of wind and snap of twigs might be a signal if you listen closely enough. I laughed it off whenever he got too mystical, but tonight I was starting to see where he might have been coming from. The three of us were in the yard, the western sky burning orange where the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. Kelsey decided she'd be it this time, so Ray and I scampered toward the slope. We both had camouflage jackets, more fashion statement than functional gear, but I like to think it helped us blend in. The plan was to outsmart Kelsey by moving uphill. She'd never guess we'd take the steeper path. Or so we thought. We crested that slope, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet the forest had become. Usually this time of evening, you can hear crickets winding up for their nighttime chorus, maybe an owl calling in the distance. That night, it felt like everything paused, waiting. Ray and I tucked ourselves into a shallow dip in the ground, just behind a line of scraggly bushes. We had a clear view of the yard, though it was getting dim. Kelsey's flashlight beam danced across the grass below, and we congratulated ourselves on the perfect hiding spot. All we had to do was lie low until she gave up. Easy enough. A moment later, a low, rhythmic pulse reached us, like a drumbeat echoing from far off. Ray's head jerked up. I glanced at him, wondering if he felt it too, that buzzing in the pit of my stomach. Drums in this part of the mountains? Maybe a local gathering, though it made zero sense for it to suddenly start after dusk. The sound grew. The beat became something more than a lone drum, chanting or singing, weaving in. And accompanying everything, a melody that shouldn't fit any of it. A high, keening note, reminiscent of bagpipes. That unexpected note stirred something protective in me, like I needed to stand up and figure out who was out there. Except, stepping forward was the last thing I wanted to do. The music peaked, reverberating through the trees, each note rippling across the slope. Ray and we just stared at each other, neither wanting to speak out loud. Even whispering felt too risky, as if we'd draw unwanted attention. My lungs begged for a deep breath, but I tried not to make a sound. Then it died away, gone in half a heartbeat. The sudden lack of noise rang in my ears more than the drumbeat did. I couldn't bear another second of stillness. Ray must have felt the same because he jerked his head downhill, eyes wide. We both sprang up, stumbling over that ridge. Gravity did half the work, sending us skidding down faster than we intended. A root snagged Ray's foot, nearly toppling him. I grabbed his sleeve, and we both regained balance long enough to lurch down into the yard. Kelsey didn't need an explanation. She stood frozen near the house's floodlight, face pale with confusion. Grandpa stepped onto the porch, an old lantern in one hand, eyebrows knit. We didn't offer much beyond a frantic, "We heard something weird." Even saying that felt like an understatement. Inside the house, we slammed the door behind us, hearts hammering. Grandpa told us to sit, voice firm but calm, and started asking questions. Ray tried to describe the chanting and the bagpipes, while I stared out the window, half expecting more noise to erupt from the hills. But everything beyond the floodlit yard was black, mute. Eventually, Grandpa checked his radio to see if there were any announcements. Some festival, a big group camping, a local event that might explain away the noise. Nothing came through. He frowned, as if something he'd worried about was stepping into reality. He suggested we all stick close, even though part of me wanted to bolt for my truck and drive into the nearest town. We ended up huddling in the living room, not saying much. Each time the house creaked with night settling in, we jerked our heads toward the windows. Part of me thought I was overreacting. The other part said I couldn't be too careful. At one point, Kelsey started describing how it sounded almost ceremonial. Ray kept mentioning the bagpipes, how out of place they felt in these mountains. Grandpa just listened in silence, like he was adding up bits of a puzzle we couldn't see. And so we waited for dawn, adrenaline coursing so hard that sleep didn't stand a chance. Whatever we heard out there, it didn't feel like an accidental jam session. It had the determined rhythm of something bigger, something we weren't meant to stumble upon. I glanced through the window one more time, across that slope where the silhouette of bare branches seemed to watch us back. The night had only just begun, and I was afraid it wasn't done revealing whatever secrets lay in those woods. Morning light had a way of making the previous night feel like a fever dream. But when I opened my eyes, the knot in my gut told me it wasn't just an overactive imagination. Ray was already awake, pacing in front of the fireplace. Kelsey sipped coffee at the window, staring off at the slope where we'd heard that eerie music. The house felt tense, like we were all braced for whatever might come next. Grandpa Morley was digging through his old field notebooks, scattering them across the kitchen table. He murmured to himself as he flipped pages, sometimes tapping a map he'd pinned down with an empty coffee cup. Finally, he called us over. "This area right here," he pointed at a forested patch just beyond the ridge. "I've heard stories about folks finding strange footprints, hearing unexplainable sounds. Never had solid proof, but no shortage of rumors." Ray wanted answers. He kept talking about how that chanting still echoed in his ears. Kelsey looked as though she wanted to crawl under a blanket and forget everything. But Grandpa said if we wanted peace of mind, we had to see what was out there in the daylight. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but curiosity gnawed at me. The only way to settle my nerves was to confront whatever was lurking in those trees. We followed the same path as the night before, only this time, sunbeams cut through the canopy. The forest felt awake now, birds calling overhead, the smell of wet leaves underfoot. My boots squelched in the soft soil. About 20 minutes in, we spotted footprints in the mud near an old game trail. More than one set, too. Some were big enough that I wondered if a whole group had come through. Kelsey knelt down, tracing the edges with her fingertips. She didn't say a word, but her expression told me she was unsettled. As we pressed deeper, a low clearing opened up. In the center were stones stacked in a wide circle. The ground was littered with scorched branches, as if a fire had burned there recently. I kicked at a pile of ash, uncovering what might have been animal bones. Nearby, Ray found shredded fabric snagged on a sharp branch, checkered like tartan. The breath caught in my throat. Bagpipes, a Scottish pattern, and those drum rhythms. None of it added up, but it sure felt connected. Before we could piece things together, that same beat thrummed in the distance. All three of us froze, and every nerve I had went on high alert. The chanting returned, and with it came a deeper, resonating drumbeat that rattled through the trees. We ducked behind an uprooted trunk, peering over as shadows flickered beyond the bushes. I saw multiple figures moving, at least 5 or 6, too many to count accurately. One carried what looked like a bagpipe under an arm. Another brandished a tall staff decorated with dangling bits of cloth or feathers. It felt like we'd trespassed on a hidden ceremony. My pulse roared in my head, urging me to get moving. Ray tugged my jacket, and we bolted. Adrenaline drove us as we crashed through the undergrowth. The chanting didn't fade right away. In fact, for a moment it seemed to chase us, echoing in all directions. We burst out onto the slope behind the homestead, nearly stumbling over each other. Grandpa was there, a rifle propped against his hip. He took one look at our faces and told us to get inside. Over the next hour, we told him about the footprints, the circle of stones, the scrap of tartan, and the silhouettes with bagpipes in hand. He listened, and at the end, he nodded like it confirmed a rumor he'd once heard. That generations ago, certain families who settled these hills mixed cultures, Scottish and Native American, keeping old traditions alive in the most secluded spots. There was no telling if they meant harm. Grandpa planned to notify a ranger station, see if they'd heard of any suspicious gatherings. But I think we all sensed the same foreboding truth. Whatever goes on in these woods after dark might not welcome outsiders. We'd seen enough to know we didn't belong out there at night. When dusk rolled around, we stayed close to the house, porch lights blazing. Kelsey kept her eyes on the ridge, looking for any flicker of firelight or movement among the trees. Ray sat with me in the living room, occasionally glancing at the window. Every so often, I half expected those drums to sound again. Even if they stayed silent, I knew they were only a heartbeat away, tucked in the deep pockets of the Appalachians. We had a name for the fear now, but it didn't make it any less real, and it didn't keep me from wondering if, next time, we might not get away so easily. I've always said these Appalachian mountains were in my bloodstream, a legacy from my grandfather in Boone County, West Virginia. Every time I roll down the highway and see those steep ridges rising in the distance, something inside me sparks to life, like part of me recognizes home. This time, though, that welcome feeling came bundled with an unsettling undercurrent I couldn't quite explain. The plan was simple enough: drive from Michigan to New York City, pick up my friend who needed extra help traveling, and head back to Detroit. I'd done cross-country treks before, so I didn't expect anything beyond the usual long-haul hassle. The first few hours were honestly too quiet. I got pulled over in Ohio for a busted headlight, and even though the trooper was polite, my nerves still buzzed the rest of the night. The idea of sleeping in my car at a rest stop sounded okay at first, but every shuffle of footsteps outside made me sit up and peer into the dark. Eventually, I dozed off, but it was a half-baked sort of sleep that left me feeling ragged. By mid-morning, I was back on the road, cutting through Pennsylvania and drinking in the misty peaks off in the distance. Something about those valleys always puts me on edge and at ease all at once, like I belong there, but I also know the land can turn dangerous without warning. The hours ticked by, traffic thickened, and soon I was in the sprawling chaos of New York City. After a painful search for parking, I finally spotted my friend. She hopped into my cramped PT Cruiser, and I was eager to leave the city behind. There's a hyper-awareness that creeps in when I'm stuck in that much congestion. Too many headlights, too many people, and not enough personal space. We were both relieved to point the car west again. Darkness wasn't far off by the time we made decent progress. We'd agreed to pull into a large store parking lot somewhere in western Pennsylvania for the night, somewhere bright enough and busy enough that we wouldn't feel vulnerable. That's where things started getting weird. I rolled into a Walmart lot that was mostly empty except for a handful of cars clustered near the entrance. But parked a little too far out were two vehicles that gave me a sour feeling. Dark-tinted windows, engines idling like they were waiting on something. I tried to wave off my own paranoia, but every time I glanced over, one of the cars seemed to shift closer. My friend noticed it too. She nudged my arm and whispered, "Is it just me, or are they edging toward us?" Her voice was shaky, and it confirmed I wasn't imagining things. I felt tension coil in my gut. We decided to bail. No point in testing our luck. Neither of us wanted to be cornered by strangers in the middle of the night. Pulling out of that lot, I could feel my hands clenching the steering wheel. Driving away eased the pressure only slightly. The next rest stop we aimed for was tucked between shadowy ridges, nearly deserted. My headlights swept over scattered parking spots, and there in the corner was a white Jeep. Newish model, tinted windows, not a soul in sight around it. In the back of my head, I was screaming at myself that I was just being jittery, but I couldn't shake the thought, what if it followed us from the lot? It seemed too coincidental. My friend leaned forward, trying to see if anyone was inside, and that quiet question hung in the air. Could it be the same one? We didn't linger long enough to find out. I swung the car around and got back on the highway, half expecting the Jeep's headlights to pop up in my mirror. For a while, it was just darkness and winding roads, the trees crowding in on either side. My friend and I didn't talk much. We were both in our own heads. Every distant glimmer of lights behind us made my muscles tighten. A few times I caught myself speeding, pushing my old PT Cruiser harder than I should have, just wanting to be around other people, bright lights, safety. Maybe it was overblown fear, or maybe not. Eventually we spotted another big box store off the highway, a place that was open all night. We drifted into the lot, found a spot neither too hidden nor too exposed, and tried to settle in. My friend reclined her seat, fiddling with her phone, and I leaned against the door, letting my eyes close. The adrenaline buzz was fading, replaced by sheer exhaustion. The plan was simple: get some rest, wake up, and push on at dawn. That's all we needed, right? But a nagging alarm kept sounding in the back of my mind. I couldn't help imagining a set of headlights rolling in beside us again. I'd always prided myself on having good instincts, especially on the road, and something was shouting at me to stay alert. Maybe the night was messing with my head, maybe it was the mountain air, but I couldn't settle. I just kept checking the rearview mirror and scanning the corners of the lot, half conscious, waiting for a sign that everything was about to unravel. Looking back, I should have known I wasn't going to get a peaceful rest. The real trouble was just around the corner, and a part of me sensed it even then. The mountains have a way of holding secrets close, and that night, it felt like I was driving straight into one. I'd been through my fair share of late-night drives, but none that left me quite this tense. We'd found another big parking lot, a large store glowing in the distance like some lifeline, and I figured we could finally try to rest. My friend was nodding off in the passenger seat, leaning her head against the window. My eyes felt heavy, but every time I let them close, I'd jolt awake at the faintest hint of movement in my mirrors. At first, the lot seemed almost peaceful, only a smattering of cars, plenty of overhead lights, and the steady hum of night shift employees hauling carts around. I tried to tell myself we'd been imagining things earlier, that those suspicious vehicles were just random folks passing through. Then I spotted headlights drifting in from the far side of the lot, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened again. A white Jeep Compass glided across the asphalt and parked right next to us. There were at least a dozen other open spaces, so why pick the one so close? I glanced to my left, and there he was, the same driver who'd been lingering in my memory, like a fleeting shadow I couldn't quite get rid of. He was young but worn somehow, his gaze heavy and unflinching. A cold energy rolled off him, making my nerves flare. Part of me wanted to brush it off, assume I was just stuck in my own fears. But the longer we locked eyes, the more certain I became that this wasn't random. My friend must have sensed it too. She snapped awake, following my stare. I heard her mutter something like, "Not again." And that was all the push I needed. I cranked the ignition, yanked the gear shift into drive, and tore out of there. The wheels squealed, echoing across the mostly empty lot. I almost expected the Jeep to remain behind, some bizarre coincidence put to rest. Instead, the headlights came to life and stuck to our bumper. I felt a jolt of adrenaline rush through my limbs as I realized we were being followed yet again. The highway ramp was up ahead, and I gunned it, hoping I could leave him behind in the open stretches of road. But once I merged, those lights were still there, unwavering. Mile after mile, I tried to ignore the tightness in my chest, the nagging thought that I'd let this go too far. Yet I couldn't slow down, not with that Jeep trailing me like it was locked on. Ahead, the mountains rose against the sky, dark silhouettes capped by faint moonlight. We thundered onto an exit, hoping to lose him in the twists and turns of back roads. My friend pulled out her phone, trying to chart a route that might confuse any pursuer. We zigzagged through narrow highways, winding through steep valleys and lonely clusters of trees, the path weaving in a dizzying snake-like pattern. Each time I dared glance back, those headlights burned in the darkness, unshaken by the hairpin curves. Exhaustion gnawed at me, and I wondered how long we could keep this up without making a critical mistake. The roads were almost deserted, lined with battered guardrails and the endless silhouettes of sloping ridges. Everything in me wanted to stop, to catch a moment's calm, but my instincts hollered that would be a terrible idea with this creep hanging on our tail. Then, in a flash of brilliance or desperation, I'm still not sure which, I yanked the wheel onto a hidden side route. The Jeep sped past our turn, its taillights flaring red as it tried to brake too late. A wave of relief washed over me when I realized we might have slipped his grasp. I continued down this narrow road until we reached an aging wooden sign pointing to a smaller town. Streetlights became more frequent. The black outline of the mountains gave way to a dimly lit main street, and for the first time in hours, I let myself breathe. A fast food place, maybe the only one open that early, glowed at the edge of the road. We pulled in, found a spot between work trucks and local cars. The safety of other humans moving around was enough to let the tension in my muscles ease a bit. My friend and I were so drained, we just collapsed against the seats, windows still rolled up tight. After so many panicked miles, the distant hum of a drive-through speaker and the smell of stale French fries felt like a blessing. When the sun finally started creeping over the ragged skyline of mountains, I stirred. My neck ached from sleeping at a weird angle. Outside, life was picking up, people stepping in and out, an elderly couple walking their dog along the sidewalk. No white Jeep in sight. You'd think I would have been relieved, but an odd sense of dread tugged at me. Had we really lost him, or was he just biding his time? I checked my phone, half expecting messages from family asking where I was, but it stayed eerily silent. The air felt thick with unresolved tension. My friend and I ordered some breakfast, greasy but hot, just to ground ourselves in something normal. Every so often we glanced out the windows, scanning each vehicle that pulled through. Nothing suspicious, yet neither of us could fully shake the lingering paranoia. It felt like we'd gone through some twisted rite of passage in those mountains. By the time we climbed back into the car, the morning sunlight was streaming in, almost too bright against the tiredness in our faces. A part of me wished we could head straight home without another break, but I knew I had to keep an eye out for that Jeep, as though it might materialize again. The realization was chilling. A simple trip to help a friend had morphed into this frantic late-night chase. Sure, maybe we were both wound too tight. Maybe the stranger was just some random jerk on a power trip, but I couldn't shake a deeper suspicion that he was dangerous, and that under the vast sky of Appalachia, anything could happen. We buckled up and drove off, leaving that small town in the rearview mirror. Each mile of highway felt both relieving and nerve-wracking, as if something could pop out any second. By the time we found a route that led back toward Detroit, the mountains were starting to fade behind us. I couldn't help thinking about how, despite my deep respect for those old ridges, I was leaving with a new, grim awareness of the shadows they can hide. I took a final look at the looming outlines in the mirror, imagining that white Jeep hidden somewhere in the valleys, lying in wait. Even if I never found out who was behind the wheel, that night changed me. I used to think of these roads like a second home, a place of comfort and belonging. Now, a knot of tension insisted that some things are better left alone, and that wandering too far into unknown territory can lead to horrors you can't always outrun.